This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Israel and the U.S. face off over plans for an American consulate for the Palestinians in Jerusalem.
Ramallah is not Jerusalem, and Ramallah is not the capital of Palestine. We want this consulate in Jerusalem to be the future American embassy to the state of Palestine.
Plus, the one-year anniversary of the Abraham Accords and what's next for these historic agreements. And the Christian Media Summit. Israel connects Christian journalists around the world with the State of Israel. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. The relationship between the Palestinian Authority and the Biden administration has shifted dramatically from the former administration of President Trump. CBN News went to Ramallah to hear firsthand how one PA leader wants to make the most of this new relationship. Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh wants the world to know he's satisfied so far with what he's hearing from Washington.
Our relationship with the new American administration has been going very well based on the promises that were made by the Biden administration. We think that this administration is a real departure from where we were with President Trump. It's our hope that the promises will be fulfilled.
Shtayyeh says those specific promises include restoring funding to UNRWA, maintaining the status quo agreement on the Temple Mount where only Muslims are allowed to pray, opposing Israeli construction in Judea and Samaria, what's also referred to as the West Bank. The State Department told CBN News in a statement the U.S. does support the status quo agreement on the Temple Mount, opposes unilateral steps that undercut negotiations like settlement construction in the West Bank, and is currently providing $450 million to the Palestinian Authority, some of which is pledged to UNRWA. Perhaps the biggest public nod from the Biden administration came early this year, when Secretary of State Antony Blinken indicated the U.S. would reopen its consulate to the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem.
That's an important way for our country to engage with and provide support to the Palestinian people.
That promise met stiff resistance from Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett.
Our position is, and it was presented very clearly and openly to our American friends, that there's no room for another American consulate in Jerusalem.
Foreign Minister Yair Lapid suggested the PA use Ramallah as an alternate location. Prime Minister Shtayyeh made it clear that the Palestinian Authority doesn't want the U.S. consulate here in Ramallah, but only in Jerusalem.
Ramallah is not Jerusalem, and Ramallah is not the capital of Palestine. We want this consulate in Jerusalem to be the future American embassy to the state of Palestine. And I think that Biden administration has been very clear about it. And they did speak loudly about it. And it's our hope that what they promised, it will be fulfilled. And we have been assured by congressmen, by other officials, that this will be on their agenda.
This conversation brings into question a divided Jerusalem, which Palestinians want as part of a so-called two-state solution. Israeli leaders maintain the city is their capital and will remain unified. Former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Danny Ayalon says reopening the U.S. consulate to the Palestinians would jeopardize relations with Israel and endanger the Jewish state's fragile new government.
I think that could really wreak havoc within this government. There's no way politically that Bennett could agree to that. The opposition, which is still headed by Bibi Netanyahu, would have a heyday, and that could spark a large demonstrations. The anger and the frustration will not be channeled at the United States, but to the Israeli government.
Ayalon says the consulate dilemma puts the U.S. in an untenable situation, with promises to the PA on the one hand and violating Israeli sovereignty on the other. Earlier, Israeli leaders presented a united front against the reopening of the U.S. consulate for the Palestinians in Jerusalem. CBN News also asked Israelis what they thought about the idea.
Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said Israel is standing its ground regarding the consulate, but not picking a fight with the U.S.
There's so much more we agree upon with our American friends than we disagree upon, but indeed, our position is, and it was presented very clearly and openly to our American friends, that there's no room for another American consulate in Jerusalem.
The U.S. recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel in 2017 and then moved its embassy here in 2018. Palestinian affairs were then put under the authority of the embassy. Now experts say reopening the consulate for Palestinians in Jerusalem would effectively take a step toward redividing the city. Palestinians agree it would constitute the seed of a U.S. embassy in the state of Palestine. Bennett said Israel had presented its position quietly and without drama.
We expect it to be understood. Jerusalem is the capital of one state, and that's the state of Israel. I'm sure our American friend and us will continue to collaborate on a long list of big things.
Foreign Minister Yair Lapid said it's not a question of politics, but the position of the state of Israel.
It's a principled opposition from the State of Israel to the opening of a consulate in Jerusalem. There's an American embassy, and if, by the way, they want to open one in Ramallah, we have no problem with that.
CBN News asked Israelis about the idea of a Palestinian consulate in Jerusalem. Here's what they had to say.
It's a mistake and it shouldn't happen. There's one city that's the capital of Israel, and that's Jerusalem. We don't need to have another consulate.
I think it's a mistake. It's like we do one step further and one step back. It's a big mistake.
In the Bible, it's written about Jerusalem, the territories to whom they belong, who divided them. Not today, 4,500 years ago. If you look at history, if you look at the source, the Palestinians and the Arabs both agree that Jerusalem belongs to the people of Israel.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Up next, 1 year after the historic agreement, CBN News looks at the Abraham Accords and what's next for the region. In the 14 months following the signing of the Abraham Accords, relations between Israel and many of its Arab neighbors are flourishing, and a number of world leaders are surprised over the dramatic progress. Take a look.
In one of the latest signs of cooperation, Israel and the United Arab Emirates signed a joint venture to send an unmanned vehicle to the moon by 2024. That followed a surprise visit last month during a multinational military exercise when the commander of the UAE Air Force met with his Israeli counterpart. And on the commercial front, this Israeli expo in Dubai is another sign of success resulting from the historic peace agreement.
It's been amazing, the progress. We're watching business deals to be developed, tourism deals. We're seeing the Jerusalem Post forming a media alliance with an Emirati newspaper and TV company. We're seeing Israeli airlines open up direct routes to Arab countries, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco. We're seeing Moroccan and Emirati and Bahraini airlines flying direct routes into Israel.
Best-selling author Joel Rosenberg chronicles the creation and progress of the Accords in his latest book, Enemies and Allies. CBN News has followed Rosenberg as he's organized delegations of evangelical leaders to meet with Arab heads of state.
I've sat with them, I've listened to them, both before the Abraham Accords and now that it's open. And the Arab leaders are very, very excited. Not just what's happening in the last year and a few months, but where this is going.
One of the agreement's architects, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, tells CBN News he sees a bright future for the Abraham Accords.
I think this changed history. I don't think it's going to go back. I think the people of these nations can see that this is the rightful Jewish homeland. It ought to be recognized as such. It's not good foreign policy to have the destruction of Israel at the center of how you think about the world. The commerce, the trade, the defense work that will be done between these nations will create prosperity for people in every one of them. And I think that's why ultimately there will be many other nations that will see this as both right and righteous.
Here in Israel, what began under the Netanyahu government is continuing with the aggressive pursuit by the coalition of Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. Still, a lingering concern here is whether the Biden administration will invest the political capital and diplomatic muscle to advance the accords.
This recent trilateral meeting between the U.S., UAE, and Israel, led by Secretary of State Antony Blinken, suggests a positive direction.
Today, our three countries discussed two new working groups that we are launching together. The first is on religious coexistence. This is a moment of rising anti-Semitism, rising Islamophobia, and we want Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States to work together to build tolerance and ensure that all religious groups can worship in their traditional ways without violence, without intimidation, without discrimination.
Another remaining question 1 year into the accords is, will Saudi Arabia, the largest and most influential Sunni Arab nation, take steps to join?
The short version is, I believe the Saudis are weighing right now at the highest levels. Is it in their national interests to make peace with Israel? It is saying both publicly and privately the Saudis are moving towards normalization. But they're not there yet. I think there's going to be a lot of reporting we still need to do. But when that happens, if it happens, I think it will. My prediction on CBN News is I think the Saudis are going to make that decision, that it is in their national interests.
Overshadowing the success of any peace effort remains the specter of a nuclear Iran. In just weeks, the U.S. and other nations that signed the original Iranian nuclear deal are scheduled to resume negotiations.
It was a bad deal 6 years ago. It is a bad deal today. I hope the U.S. will not make that mistake again. And look what happened in the last 6 years. They enriched more uranium, they developed the ballistic missile technology, they're sending billions of dollars to their proxies. It will be a major mistake if the US and the P5 will actually join this agreement.
You not only have the Iran threat, but Iran forming an alliance with Russia and Turkey and North Korea and China. So that's the darkness to the east and the north, and then we have all this light here and to the west. And so, to use a weather analogy, those are two building fronts, and there's always the danger that when those two fronts meet, there's going to be a storm.
From most accounts, the report card on 1 year of the Abraham Accords reflects a substantial transformation in the region. While the signing members seem resilient, it's almost certain Middle East opponents of these agreements will test their resolve.
Coming up, Israel's ambassador to the UK becomes the target of an anti-Semitic attack. Is this a one-time incident or a trend? Israel's ambassador to the UK, Zippy Hotovely, was rushed to her car under heavy security after a speaking engagement at the London School of Economics. Hotovely spoke for an hour and a half and answered questions, but protesters outside the event screamed at the ambassador as she left the building. I discussed this incident with Danny Danone, Israel's former ambassador to the United Nations, in our studio. Ambassador Danone, thanks for joining us. Is this a one-time incident, or do these kind of things happen to Israeli ambassadors on a regular basis?
Unfortunately, Chris, it's not a one-time incident. I myself visited hundreds of events on campuses, and I have seen similar attacks coming from anti-Semitic groups. The attacks are in the halls and outside the halls. The demonstrations are there. But the message is that we should continue to go to those places. We should speak up. We should represent our country with pride, and we should not allow those violent rioters to disturb us.
Ambassador Danone, could this be the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, of more anti-Semitism that's rising in the United States and even around the world?
So first, the facts speak for themselves. Anti-Semitism is on the rise all around the world, including the U.S. According to the recent FBI report, all over the U.S., we have seen an increase in attacks against Jews in the U.S., which is unfortunate, and especially on campuses. It's organized, it's orchestrated, and I think that the way to behave is to increase our presence on campuses, to work with our allies, Christian and Jewish groups on campuses. And when you have a demonstration, I would expect the local police to take action and not to rush the dignitary out of the hall. When I was at the UN for 5 years, I always made sure that when we go to a campus, we walk from the front door and we exit from the front door proud and tall. And I can recall an event at Columbia University where there were hundreds of demonstrations outside the hall, and we continued with the event. We finished the event, and the message is that we demand and expect from the universities and the local police to take actions in order to allow the freedom of speech everywhere and for everyone.
Ambassador Danon, you talk about college campuses. Is this really one of the front lines of anti-Semitism right now in the U.S. and around the world?
It is the front line because we have seen a lot of investments from our adversaries, mainly the BDS movement. They put a lot of money and time in order to promote hate on campuses. Unfortunately, sometimes we see faculty members joining them. So we shouldn't be silent. We should take actions. We should come to the campuses, speak there, and empower the majority, the silent majority that has nothing against Israel. And by the way, Chris, most of those people who demonstrate against Israel, they have no clue about the topics, about the issues. When I was actually debating them during my speeches, and I asked them to come and have a debate, they had no clue about the issue. They come because they are full of hate against them. Many people, they have many reasons to hate everybody, but they have no clue about what's happening on the ground. Since
this is spreading around campuses and around the world, what's the solution, Ambassador?
I think first we should increase our presence on campuses. We should empower the pro-Israel groups on campuses, and we do have a presence there. And we should demand that the universities will allow more speakers come to present our. Now, when we speak about the London School of Economics, they hosted Gaddafi from Libya a few years ago. There were no major disruption for his speech. So we should demand from the universities, the same way they allow Gaddafi or Ahmadinejad came to New York a few years ago, they should allow dignitaries and ambassadors to come and present the truth.
Is this only for Israeli ambassadors? Are other ambassadors for other countries, are they attacked?
Well, usually you will see demonstrations, but you will not see violence like we saw in the UK. You will not see the amount of hate like we saw, because that's the strategy of the BDS movement. They're violent, aggressive, and that is unique against Israel.
Final thoughts, Ambassador, of how this should be treated here in Israel as well. Do you see more advocacy groups to be able to take these positions on college campuses?
I can tell you that personally, I decided that after that incident that I will increase my presence on campuses. I call my colleagues to do the same. I think we should go out there. I was a student myself, and I remember when a dignitary used to come, it was the highlight of the year for us. So we should come and support the students. For us, it's not a challenge to come for 2 hours for an event. But think about the students who have to deal with the hatred 24/7.
I understand. Well, Ambassador Danon, thanks for joining us on this very important topic about what's happening on college campuses and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg.
Up next, the 5th Annual Christian Media Summit, connecting Christian journalists around the world with the issues confronting the Jewish state. More than 100 participants from around the world took part in the 5th Annual Christian Media Summit, hosted by Israel's government press office. It was held virtually for the second year in a row. And as CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl tells us, it focused on the Abraham Accords.
Israel's President Isaac Herzog welcomed the attendees on the Zoom meeting.
It is a pleasure to welcome you to this year's Christian Media Summit under the heading entitled Abraham Accords and Abrahamic Religions, Partners in Peace. What a beautiful title.
Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett spoke of the challenge of radical militant Islam in the Middle East and Israel's relationship to Christians.
In the Middle East, there's only one place that fully protects Christian life, where the Christian community is growing, thriving, and prospering, and that's in the state of Israel.
Israel signed the historic Abraham Accords with 4 Arab states, starting with the United Arab Emirates last year. Hadassah Schwartz and Nitzan Chen from the government press office honored former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for his work in bringing about those accords.
The Abraham Accords were a historic turning point. This is the first time that Israel made peace for peace. Peace with 4 Arab nations, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and the Sudan. Peace that was benefiting the peoples of both sides in the economy, in trade, in tourism, in technology.
Cairo's company founder, Johnny Moore, addressed the issue of anti-Semitism.
Centuries of anti-Semitism, centuries of conflict between the communities, centuries of harm. And yet now, 80 million evangelicals in the United States, 800 million evangelicals around the world, are the great firewall against anti-Semitism. We are living in the golden age of Jewish-Christian friendship.
Bishop Glenn Plummer spoke about Black Zionism.
Dr. Martin Luther King probably is the one who best defined it. And so this is not a new concept. I only mention him because that's 50 plus years ago. And Dr. King himself defined Zionism.
Panels examined press coverage in the UAE and Bahrain since the Accords, as well as how the Abraham Accords have impacted the relationship between Israeli Arabs and Jews. The conference ended with the yearning of Jews from around the world for millennia and the declaration of many Christians now.
Jerusalem is here in our heart, waiting for you to come and visit, and to that we say together, next year in Jerusalem.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.